inspirational storytelling network, and we bring together to you authors from around the world, authors who write across genres, fiction, nonfiction, books that are really impactful, like today's author. And it's really a pay it forward movement, a part of Women Inspiring Network. And the whole idea is to bring together to you stories and inspirational journeys of people, of content creators, so that you can take inspiration, you can learn the tricks and tips from them and bring it into your own lives. In Winning Minds, we've been really documenting the work of very talented authors. And the whole idea is to understand what drives them, how do they harness energy to write, and what do they do to create and craft the stories and the books that they write. So without much ado, let me first welcome Deepa Narayan.
Thank you, Amrita. Pleasure to be here with you.
Wonderful to have you here, Deepa. So Dr. Narayan is the author of a groundbreaking book called Chup, which is the silence, breaking the silence about India's women. And we'll learn a lot more about this really impactful book that every girl and every woman should know about and read and take lessons from, in our own lives. But she's got a history of writing books. She's had over 25 years of experience working with the World Bank, United Nations, and multiple nonprofit organizations. She's written 17 books on poverty, on gender inequality, development, and much more. Right? She's been named as one of the 100 most influential global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine and by one of the great thinkers by India Today. And Chup, her book, is not just a book, it's a movement. And we'll learn a lot more about it as we talk to her. So again, Deepa, very welcome indeed. So as we begin our conversation today, Deepa, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey, right? What led you to writing books in the first place? What were your early motivations and inspirations? And the moment or the moments before you wrote the very first book, the one of 18.
Yeah, let me go back to a very, very long time ago because I don't think writers are born, they're made. I think that's the first thing for everyone to hear. I have to tell you, my beginnings were very shaky. When up till about grade, my sister used to write all my papers. I have an older sister who's 3 years older, and my writing was so bad, and I was so playful that when it was time to give in an assignment in school, she would help me, and I remember that so well. My first book, and I guess the last one too, all my books were motivated by bringing change, bringing about change. That there was always, I've been involved in poverty reduction for the last 30 years. So it was always seeing a problem and how do you change it. And that really was the motivation, that when I saw the problem over and over again and nothing changed, I would learn more about the problem and then write about it in a way that was easy for people to understand. I think that's really key because there's so much information in academia. There's so much good research being done all over the world, but it doesn't get into the hands of people, and so it doesn't get translated into books that are readable. So I think that really was, if I was to look back and think about what's unique about my writing in the policy world, it would be that I started very early. My first book was actually at the UN and then at the World Bank. It went back to a very basic issue, which is how do you get clean water into people's homes in rural areas for poor people. And the realization was that it's women who are more affected, and women who fetch water. And so, if you're going to build water systems in rural areas that get used, you've got to understand the psychology, the motivation, the organization, the politics of women and men in local villages, so that not only can you meet their needs, but that the infrastructure, the pumps you build, get taken care of. so that if the first problem, they have the motivation to overcome it and make sure the pumps or the taps or whatever is happening keep working. I think that's a thread that I still see through my all my work, which I hadn't thought of before till you asked me this question.
No, like, that's really fantastic to hear that, it's real world problems that you're looking at and talking about and trying to see how your books can impact change. Do you have a lens in mind? Like, are you looking at influencing policymakers and governments? Are you looking at influencing donors? Do you have to have a specific strict lens in mind, or are you looking at the general population and creating a grounds up awareness movement? How do you build that?
I think for me, it's been keeping a general. If you think about, let me take the example of water supply, or about uh, how women are behaving, or about nutrition.
Mhm, mhm,
The way you would speak to uh, an engineer coming back to water supply would be different from the way you would speak to someone sitting at the mid level in the government of India or at the UN, and who had decision making authority on water systems or how to think or how to design a multi-million, a 60 million or $100 million project on rural water systems. So I would think about those people. So who's my user? Who do I want to influence, and keep that in mind? So in writing Chup, I thought about a middle class woman who I would like to have read this book and see herself reflected in it. So for if I want to change how water systems are done in rural India, I would write it very differently. But I always use a lot of very simple examples and simple language, a simple everyday language, so that you don't have to have a PhD thesis to understand a rural water supply system, or you don't have to have be a gender specialist to understand, or a feminist theorist to understand a book on women. So I think the only way we can bring about change in any world, whether it's about contraception or about education, is to write in a way that's simple and comprehensible and inspiring. It has to be all. I think my biggest realization was very early on that you don't need to use big words.
sure.
You have to be understood, and big words come in the way often.
That's really fantastic. Now, the question is that all of your books have perhaps are relying on a lot of research, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure this is primary research as well as secondary research. So, what's the process of actually diving and digging deep into the information that you want to present, and then what is the craft of what you said, it should be simple but it needs to be evocative because you are telling stories. So how do you crystallize let's say mountains and mountains of research into mini nuggets and mini stories that then capture our imaginations as readers, as decision makers, what have you?
Right. My process is very messy because at heart, I'm really a researcher and a policy wonk. And the two don't combine very well, because usually researchers is a different group of people and policy people are a different group of people. And sort of my interest was in closing the gap or addressing policymakers. Policymaker can be a father, by the way, right? In the home, a
Sure,
policymaker is
sure.
the father. He's the rule maker. So it's again to simplify that and bring it down to ways which can be understood. So I do a lot of research in any book that I write. I would say I've been guilty of over researching, and that's not a good thing. Um, but it all that really diving deep into a subject would give me the confidence that I'm saying what I'm saying makes sense. In in the books that I've written about poverty and development, I would often have a research team, and sometimes it was by myself, and it basically read really widely.
Mhm.
Sometimes I use the process of cards,
Sure.
like this to write down an idea which so many people use. It has never really worked very well for me because you have to be very organized. You can write the cards, but if you don't look at them again. But one of the fun processes for me for my last book is because there wasn't a clear storyline. When you do 600 interviews and you have 18,000 pages of notes, and that's primary data, and then you have all the background research, how do you make sense of it? And then I start thinking, I basically look at patterns that come up. So, what are the things that keep coming up again and again?
Sure.
And that then starts narrowing down what the framing is. So, I think in the research process, what's important is coming up with a framework. And I think what's been important in the kind of research that I do, because I try to use open ended methods, but still come up with some new insights, right? So, that's the challenge. If you start with wanting to prove something, then you know and you go looking for that thing,
Mhm, mhm,
right? But if you say what I'm interested in is how poor people think about water or about how women think about their lives, it's very open ended,
mhm.
and but it's more challenging, but the joy is you come up with new insights. And so it's a process of being really wide and starting to narrow down and looking for patterns of behaviors or thoughts or ideas that then become the key idea that you focus on. And so for example, the issue of women smiling. I didn't say I'm going to write about smiling, but if it comes up over and over again by women and by men, then I dig in more into what's happening here or how women walk.
Mhm.
How does a confident woman walk? I didn't start the research thinking about that, but if it comes up over and over again, then I follow that thread. So it's both. The broad research provides a very broad framing, but it's so open that then you have to start looking for the repeated patterns of behavior
Mhm.
that then provide me the clues. It's like I call myself a cultural detective. So when I talk about trying to understand, it's really about trying to understand human beings and the in and uh, their lived environment. And their lived environment is not just their families, but their communities, but also if you're trying to design water systems or nutrition systems uh, or educational systems, then you have to understand the overall built environment as well as the incentive environment. Why do people basically, if I was to summarize it all, it would be why is it that people do what they do?
Yeah, you're trying to uncover a lot of motivations, right?
Exactly.
Uh,
And keeping it very behavioral as well. Why do people behave the way they do?
and without, you don't have the hypothesis done in advance, but once you have the research is when you are structuring
Right.
that information and that data,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Exactly. So I most of my research has been very open-ended and with some ideas to guide it,
Mhm.
but wait till the end before you start closing in to this is what's happening or this is the focus. Um, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. So once you have, let's talk a little bit about, before, one or two more questions before we move into CHUP. So when you have this mountain of data, as you said, 18,000 pages of notes, did you say?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's true.
yeah.
So I think the funniest image is because I also travel a lot, is I would have one extra suitcase of my notebooks that
Yes.
went everywhere with me when I was doing CHUP, which meant from the US to India and back. So yeah, it was ridiculous, but I have it all electronically, but I like to have the paper with me.
So once you have that, then how do you, what's the process of structuring this into themes? I mean, you showed the cards, but do you use post-its? Do you use electronic tools? How do you
Everything.
synthesize sort of
Yeah,
patterns
yeah.
automatically?
I use everything because at different times different processes work for me. So I have it electronically, And before the order emerges, I just throw ideas into the ideas as they come to me. I write them on pieces of paper, and then I take a large sheet and rearrange to see if there's any logic or what are the connections. And then try try different connections till something clicks. And of course, in the back of my mind, there is theory. It's not that it's happening totally in a vacuum, but the idea is not to run to the obvious, because there are so many ways of looking at the same behaviors, right? So then eventually something makes sense. So for the my earlier work in terms of voices of the poor or moving out of poverty, the broad question was, what does poverty mean to poor people? What does being poor look like in their language, in their terms, in their things? What are the constraints? And eventually what I came up with was the two big issues that emerged was powerlessness and voicelessness. Now, if I'd started and then there was, what does powerlessness look like to a poor person living in a village in Kenya, for example, or in Bihar? And so then there would be multiple dimensions on that. So that's how then, but those dimensions emerged over time. And then we had sort of diagramming the connections, how one thing leads to another, literally, and how it all hangs together. Because we tend to look in, especially in the policy worlds, you tend to look at life in silos, right? You have a ministry of education, you have a ministry of water supply, you have a ministry for roads, etc., etc. And even at our lives, it's sliced up, right? You have, for education, you go here. For for training on something else, you go there. For nutrition, you go here. So, but actually, as human beings, it's much more holistic. It's interconnected in our lives. So I think that's the balance.
I couldn't agree more that we need to have a systems thinking sort of a lens and be able to visualize, like, how one factor impacts another factor and so on, right? And it's these are very complex fields with many factors, right? Like, from the
Mhm.
internal behavioral factors to our perceived reality to the economic reality to the social and community reality, which impacts some of these decisions. So do you
Exactly.
visualize it? What is your process like? Do you sort of because you started talking about the maps and the interconnections, so is there at some point of time, like, the diagramming that you're talking about,
I
how?
diagram, but I think my big insights have come from going to walks and leaving everything aside and having these aha moments. And then it all sort of falls together, because um it's in any writing or any research, there has to be something new, something different. I mean, otherwise, why should anyone bother to read? So it is, as we talked earlier, it's telling a story, but telling it in an interesting way. Whether it's a story of how did a village or how did 100 villages end up getting clean water, you can be very cut and dry about it, or you can tell it as a story that's not only interesting, but from which you learn about how to create water systems that work in thousands of villages. And it's the same thing about rural development, urban development, or how do poor people manage money. So at its best, I think books are about telling stories.
No, I think we understand and perceive, like, things through stories, so it's really critical.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Now, you said something else which was, like, really critical, because you said about the lens through which you perceive, like, a situation, and the lens would be different for a villager versus, like, somebody in the ministry versus a mid-level bureaucrat. So but you as the researcher and you as the author, when you're in the field and you're both collecting data and inferring data as you go along, and then there is sort of a cohesive inferencing that you do at the end of your entire data collection. Right. How do you ensure that there is no bias in that process of collecting data or inferring data? Because in the
I
books,
don't
right?
do, yeah, yeah. No, it's a very important question that you've asked. I think data, figuring out the focus of the research or the book, whatever it is that you're doing, and the data collection, I keep that very separate from the process of making inferences, right? So I often don't see the significance of what someone has said until I'm back in the office and I'm poring over data. And that really is pattern detection, whether you call it statistics or whether you're using qualitative data. So I think that to me is very important. Second, as human beings, you can never completely claim to be objective, and anyone who does is fooling themselves. I think it's how do you minimize bias. And I minimize bias by asking the same question of many people until you start getting a similar answers. That's one way. And the second is by being a really good listener, so that you let people tell their story and you don't worry too much. I mean, obviously you're asking questions to follow up and to understand, but I think I think the most critical skill is being a good listener.
It's amazing how many books have come out in the last few years about listening well, because all our lives, we were said, okay, in order to succeed, you need to be an extrovert, you need to speak, you need to make your voices felt. And now, there's this new theory of leadership that is emerging from many quarters saying that a good leader needs to be a good listener as well, right?
Absolutely. You can't, if you're full of yourself, that you can't listen. It's very simple.
So let's move into Chup, right? It's a book, it's a movement. What was your motivation? Why did you choose to write this book, and how did the thought strike you?
It was very organic. I had no intention of writing a book because I thought it was ridiculous how many books I'd written, and it was time to stop. It was after the Nirbhaya rape, where like millions of women and men in India and elsewhere was very disturbed, and so I asked the question: is why is this happening so much in India? And again, I think your questioning has already laid the groundwork for the way I approached it, which was with curiosity and listening. And I don't know how, but very quickly I came to the question on I wanted to understand the roots of rape. And I felt that the roots lie probably are not close to the rape itself, but somewhere else. And so to me, the foundational question was what does it mean to be a good woman or a good man? And when I got invited by St. Stephen's College in Delhi University to talk about poverty, I asked to speak about exploring or doing an interactive session with the students and asking them these questions and having them write down their answers and then having a discussion so that people felt free to talk about what they felt. And it was quite astonishing because the definitions and the words they used were at least 40, 50, 60 years old. And these are the best and the brightest. And so it made me very curious about what is happening. That we said that women's lives would change or women would be respected once women and men were more educated, had higher incomes, and women were free to move around. All that has happened. Then why is it that um, rapes are still happening? So that really was the starting point. And from St. Stephen's College, as I thought about it, I said, there's something happening here. I'm not quite sure what's happening. So I went to one more college and one more college. And I said, if this is already happening with 20-year-olds, maybe I should go younger. And so then I started going into schools and talking to children and talking to my nieces and nephews, even 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, because I think this training on gender, what it means to be a good girl or a good boy, starts in every home very, very early and then gets reinforced by society. So as I did that, it occurred to me that there's a story here that hasn't been told, and that we have been too impressed by the external changes and haven't paid any attention or enough attention to the internal conditioning. And so that's how the journey began. So I didn't begin uh, by thinking I'm going to write a book. No, I was just writing a column in a local newspaper in Goa at that time,
Mhm.
because that's where I was living. And it started from there. And then I realized, after done 50 interviews, I realized this could go on forever. So then I recruited a team of young women who lived in different parts of Delhi, and in some in Bombay and Gujarat and Bangalore, and it grew from there. So it became, it took over my life. Actually, I don't know if you've seen my TED Talk. My TED Talk summarizes the book that was hosted by Shah Rukh Khan, and you can find that on the TED.com site, global platform, which really asks the question, really gets into the question of gender inequality. And it's not to blame women or to blame men or to blame culture, but it's really to unpack culture and see the gap between our beliefs and our everyday behavior. It's about everyday behavior that we practice. So our beliefs may be that I may believe that I'm totally independent or I'm fearless and I can speak up. But if every time in a meeting, if I hesitate to speak up, there's something else happening. And just being told you should speak up may not be enough for some women to be able to speak up, because there are a lot of fears when you're told when you're very young to mat bolo, don't speak, chup raho. That's where the word chup comes from, which is actually, I read an article, I was reading the newspapers, Times of India, and they said that chup in, I think, 2017 entered the English Oxford dictionary as an English word because it's used so frequently in India. There were 90 words that were chosen from all over India that entered the Oxford dictionary. So I said, well, that's the title of the book.
Oh, that's fantastic. I did listen to your TED talk, and it is really amazing. Like, the seven traits that you talk about that, that women or families, create the behaviors that families have, which holds back.
Families. It's all training. I think it's really, really important to remember when we talk about this. This is not genetic, this is all training.
Yes,
And what we're trained to do, we can unlearn.
absolutely, absolutely. And so, two questions over here, just to unpack that. You said you had interviewed about 6,000 interviews, right? And
600.
600. And did you also talk to the men to understand their perceptions and their beliefs as to why they act or behave in a particular way? And was there a difference in the perception or, motivations of men and women of different ages that you spoke with?
Yeah. It's a lot you've packed into that question. So let me try and unpack that. Let me address, and then please remind me if I haven't addressed any of the issues. I interviewed both men and women, uh, and I interviewed women about themselves and men about themselves, their own lives. And then some of it was how women think about men and how men think about women. Um, so it wasn't focusing, none of the questions focused on gender equality. It was focusing on understanding women's everyday lives and men's everyday lives. Um, in terms of age, I had initially thought I would interview women from 18 to 65, 70. And then one day I was watching television, the news hour, and I think it was a Barkha Dutt show where she had many statisticians on and great policymakers. And basically they were saying that young women today are so modern that they have no problems, that modern women are so different from women 20 years ago or 30 years ago that they don't have issues. And and the what struck me about that was that just because, again, modern women, because they're educated and they dress well and they have much more independence than before, doesn't mean that our problems have gone away. And so I dropped the focus on women over 50, 60, and focused much more on younger women because I didn't want the study to be dismissed or the book to be dismissed or the findings to be dismissed because uh, for people to say, oh, that's true for you or for a 50-year-old or a 40-year-old, but not for a 19-year-old. So the book focuses a lot on younger women. The second thing that I did with two other exclusions, one was men, that the story of women was so complex in unpacking that talking about men in the same breath became too complicated. It became very difficult to follow the storyline. So men got deleted from it. And during, I included some things, but during the editing process, the editors took out most of that. The last exclusion was poor people. So the book focuses on the middle class because I feel that we are the most in delusion or denial of how we are. Not that nothing is working, lots is working, obviously. There's lots of positive stuff, but the areas where we're stuck, we're reluctant to see. And so I wanted the book to be a wake up call to interrupt our habits, our bad habits that we've learned that no longer serve us because we expect women to be want women to be free, independent, use their education, use their minds. If we want women to use their minds, it's ridiculous for parents because we do it automatically for parents to shut a child up when they're expressing or shut a girl up when they're expressing their opinion, even when they're very young. Right. So the practice has to start early. It doesn't suddenly happen when you go to work the first day.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot, there's a lot, so much of cultural and societal bias comes into play in how we behave inside our private domains, which then conditions, like, people to behave in a different way or in a specific way in the outside domain. And it's not what you say, it's how you act, right? And that's
Right.
really
Right.
important.
And it's the fears inside. So I think the insight in the book is that we're still training girls not to exist. So it's even more complex. So on the one hand, you have all these messages about empowerment, which is great. And on the other hand, your entire system is set up to negate the existence or the
Mhm,
full blossoming of a girl.
mhm,
So it's these two systems that are colliding that we're not seeing. So all I'm doing is making us see that and being very specific. And that's why I've broken it into habits. And I talk about habits because a habit, by definition, is something that you've learned. Right. So immediately I want to get away from the whole debate about how this is genetic and that women and men are fundamentally different. And so, of course, women are not good at this and not good at that. I want to bypass that whole argument and say, these are habits, these are trained habits. This is how anytime when you go to a family with small kids, 1 year old or 2 year olds or 3 year olds, 5 year olds, within 5 minutes you hear अच्छे बेटे ऐसे नहीं करते, good boy doesn't do this, or अच्छी लड़कियां ऐसे नहीं करती, अच्छी लड़की बनो, be a good girl. What is that training? You're telling a child that this is right and moral and good, and that is not good and moral. And the other thing that comes up, the auntie kya bolengi? Look at auntie, what will she say? So immediately you're training the kid that the other people around you are the monitors of your behavior or the judges of whether you're good or not. So of course we're completely tuned in to how others think about us. So this happens in every culture. So it's not just Indian culture. I chose to focus on Indian culture because that's the culture I come from and the culture that I wanted to wake up, and how we can really take advantage of the opportunities that are being presented in the world today, but how women and men are locked into place until we change these behaviors. And it's very, very important. This book is not about blaming women, right? It's just showing us how we behave, and then frees us up once we say that it's not our fault, right? This is training. This is very early training, so there should be no shame in it. So, and if there's no shame, then it's easy to talk about it and to change. So that's the spirit of the book.
Mhm, mhm. Absolutely. Like, it's about change. And, what you said, that it is true in every society. And if you look at, like, the Wall Street ethos, or to some extent, like, the Silicon Valley startup VC culture ethos, it's no different.
Absolutely.
It is no different. So it permeates across countries, across cultures. But the seven habits, like, that you talk about in the book. So let's talk about it from, like, the research and the data. 600 interviews, 18,000 pages of notes. How did you distill it into seven? Why seven? Why not eight? Why not nine? Like, how did that emerge? What was that process?
Um, it was again looking at the patterns of behavior, and some of the things I had guessed at. That, for example, women's bodies are important. Every society makes war on women's bodies. Men try to control women's bodies. There's a lot of shame, and this is site of conflict. So it goes back to rape, violation, abuse, etc. But I didn't know I knew it would be important, but I didn't have the details of all that emerged, right? So it's when I got clear on the fundamental thesis of what is it that leads to non existence. And I think this is really important to take seriously, because if that's the starting point, then you can see how the other everyday little behaviors uh, contribute to that and shouldn't be dismissed as jane do, let it go.
Mhm,
So if you're not supposed to exist, and let me just say one other thing. One way of not existing is by killing off women,
sure.
or by aborting female fetuses. So we know the huge data on that in terms of 60 million missing women, or the sex ratios, etc., etc. Another way of making women disappear is by training them not to exist, to minimize their existence, to literally disappear, right? So, how do we do that? The first thing that you have to do is to do away with the body, because it's the body that's the physical presence to show that I'm here, that you're there,
Mhm,
right? If you didn't have a body, you'd be a ghost. So, how do we minimize a woman's body? So, then the book goes through all these things that I saw in interviews that didn't come together. So, I put in there what are the 5 ways or 10 ways in which women's body itself is minimized. One, the way you're not supposed to look up. You're supposed to shrink. You shrink your shoulders. You minimize contract. How do you contract? So women don't sit with their legs apart. Men do.
mhm,
When a woman goes into a bus, she'll shrink or try to take less space. So we're taught with children how to, squeeze ourselves into those old ambassador cars, or into a cars, aage piche in the large families. So once girls, and also for girls to trained to that there's something wrong with their bodies, all the shame around the body, the shame around periods, this fact that girls, that in our families we're so embarrassed, parents are still so embarrassed to talk about uh, our sexual parts, the genitals. There's still no conversation about it, and so it becomes, body becomes something to be afraid of, to be ashamed about, and all the words associated with a women's body are derogatory,
mhm,
or are curse words actually, and this is not true just in India but across the world. So that itself says a lot about how a woman's body is treated. A woman's body is considered polluting. If you think about the different aspects in a culture and how a culture is framed, it's all around purity and pollution, and making a woman's body bad, a source of problems to the world,
mhm,
right? So if you forget that you're a woman and you hear all these stories, would you love your body?
mhm.
No, right? It's a source of trouble and problems. So we need to re-educate it. The whole thing about body shaming, whether it's body fat or color, is just one aspect. But the whole, so we taught to minimize our bodies. Second, if you're not supposed to exist, you don't have a body, and you minimize your body, how can you have a voice? And girls are taught very early to that their voices don't matter, that they shouldn't be argumentative, all the things that we jor se nahi bolo, don't speak loudly, speak quietly, speak like a lady, sit like a lady. It's cross cultural, right? So that becomes, then you go to work and you're suddenly expected to speak up. So what I found was that women become compartmentalized. So you may be a great talker and have voice and be able to express and get what you want at home, but when you're at work you may not be able to do it, or you can do it at work because you didn't have models, especially for the first generation of women working. You didn't have models where your mother was never working, so you made it up. You had freedom at work but you didn't at home. So it's complicated. And then there's some women who aren't able to speak at home or at work, and some who are able to speak both at work and at home. But the wake up call is, how do we minimize women's voices? It could be men's voices too, but how do we minimize? And it all starts in childhood. So the huge implications of how we raise girls and how we raise boys. By the way, the one thing I wanted to tell you, and this that I don't want to forget on masculinity, because I did not do justice to men's voices and understanding men's lives in the same way that I did women. This last year, I've gone back to that research. And so remind me to talk about it. I'll come back to
Deepa.
masculinity because that's equally important. So the seven habits, the third is talk about voice is pleasing. Uh, Girls across the world, women are supposed to please men and to please everyone. And so the smile is the way to signal that you're not a threat,
Sure.
right? So in every culture, if a woman is strong, or if a woman is not smiling, uh, male wolf calls are about smile, smile, baby, smile,
Hmm.
right? Why should a woman always be uh, uh, persona of smiling?
Sure.
Sometimes you're not happy, sometimes you're sad, sometimes you're angry. So pleasing and negating the self to please others is putting others always before you, is something that's disproportionately borne by women. I'm not saying it's wrong, but compulsive pleasing becomes a problem.
Mhm.
And when a woman or a girl tries to assert herself or do what she wants, it's labeled selfish.
Sure.
And being selfish makes us feel guilty. And again, it's a problem across the world. So we're being trained very early to perform certain roles. So then we monitor and self censor ourselves. So again, waking up to what's happening so that you can then unravel that habit and
Mhm.
start practicing in with small changes. Change. The others I'll just say quickly because people can read the book or listen to the TED talk. I talk about sexuality and how women's sexuality and desire is denied. The fifth one is women pulling down women.
Mhm.
I think it's important to also recognize this rather than say that makes us look bad. This one is, I think, the cleverest cultural trick and the most powerful cultural trick to ensure that century after century women have been kept down. Because if women unite and come together, then the whole system of male power or male dominance would fall apart, whether it's in the home or outside. And so we've made an issue. Women are trained not to trust other women in a deep way. I'm not talking about friendships. Yes, we all have women friendships. Uh, are trained deeply not to trust other women, and be loyal at all costs. Loyalty is made into a super virtue, loyalty to men. So we don't talk about what's happening within the family. What's happening in the home stays at home, etc. Sixth, I think I talk about isolation, social isolation, and this business of women not trusting other women. And I think it's dependency. And there's one other which I forget right now. It sort of all hangs together. These 7 habits that keep women in their place.
And just to build on that, right? Because there is, you said the motivation is change. So the change has to occur not just within, but it has to occur in families. It has to occur in institutions around us, like schools and workplaces, and like the entire machinery around us, right? So it's a sort of from the book to the movement, right? It needs to touch upon many people and many stakeholders and actors who are influencing and impacting the lives
Right.
and journeys of women, right? So how do you from a messaging perspective, right, in the book, in the framework of the book itself, how do you ensure that you talk to each of these stakeholders on, okay, this is the challenge, right, these are the learned behaviors, but this is the change. So how do you craft it into the book?
Um, so I feel my job as a writer is to present the findings in a way that makes it so obvious that people can change and want to change. So I didn't write the book to appeal to policymakers,
Sure.
right? So I think several things that are important about the book. First is that I focus on individuals because we are all carriers of culture. But the change is going to come about when systems change, right? So in large companies, I think HR departments are hugely important. I think male leaders, CEOs of tech companies are hugely important. Even Google had a huge gender problem, right? So why is this? Because mostly it's men in power, in control, and because these are cultural issues and they're part of all of us, we don't see them clearly. So, to bring about change, uh, policymakers have to look at it through this lens of, okay, we want women leaders. Just the rhetoric of women leaders is not going to make a difference. How do we train women and men for men to respect women and be better listeners, and for women, for example, to speak up in a way that's persuasive or to negotiate? Because even negotiation, if you're taught to, if you've been trained not to ask for yourself, how can you negotiate if you're not supposed to exist? Right. So it has profound implications in how, in our systems of HR policies, in homes, in schools. I think schools mostly reinforce traditional gender norms because teachers are human beings and are part of the same culture. The evidence shows, for example, that the expectations of boys are different than girls. And it's purely because it's a boy and not a girl, right? So boys are get beaten, have physical corporal punishment a lot more
Mhm.
than girls in schools. So all these things, or when a girl speaks up or is loud, she's still being told to be quiet. So all these things get reinforced rather than broken and taken apart. And again, it's not because teachers are wrong or bad, but they have to be woken up so that the gender curriculum, which have now been passed by the government, has a chance to make a difference. And I think it will, but it has to start with the teachers and being respectful of teachers who change their own behaviors and become aware. And then they are the models. They can model the new behaviors and then hold the space for kids to change.
Absolutely. Like, the impact that teachers can have on kids' psyche and kids' behavior is really immense. And that,
Right, right. And for, I think it's really also really important to, I think I have to keep repeating that in this world today, men are still the decision makers.
Mhm.
So they have a huge responsibility to create working environments that are respectful of women, and that encourage teamwork across genders.
I will try not to get into the whole Me Too angle, which has pulled back, some of the effort that was happening in creating advocacy for women through male champions. But let's just talk, because you talked about beliefs.
I think it's that's too important to be left, because I think that's a total cop out.
Sure. Okay.
It's a total cop out and reactionary rather than moving forward. I think men need to have the courage to say, okay, we messed up.
Mhm.
And I think one of the most important messages in my final chapter and the conclusions is, let's not shame people. So I think the Me Too movement was very important to break through the silence on the abuse. Now we've come, I wouldn't say we've come the other side, because ghastly rapes are still happening. Gang rapes are still happening in India in a way they don't seem to happen in any other country. So we're not out of the woods at all.
Mhm.
So I think the issue is that if male leaders uh, would take a stand on behalf of women and men and explain the cultural shift and change the behavioral norms and do it in a participatory way, then we can have behavioral contracts in the workspace that start training us in new habits. It's not that complicated. It's okay. How do we, if you're saying you're at work, Zomato did this one letter, and the thing about period leave that stirred up a conversation. What I think is beautiful about that and powerful about that is in the note that the CEO sent out, the last uh, lines were about a note to men on the expectation of male behavior. There was a very clear note about expectations of women's behavior, and this is part of changing the system, changing the work environment rather than changing women to fit into a man's world. I think that's the shift that needs to happen in every company, in government, in NGOs, in schools, because this gender bias is everywhere because we're all cultural creatures.
And what I have realized is that the triggers for this change, when you're looking at advocacy from male leaders, happens when they have young daughters,
Yep.
and those daughters enter the workspace. That's when, sort of there is a light shining, like moment that
Light
they
bulb.
all face,
Yeah.
like a light bulb moment, that they all face. But the other critical aspect of men, uh, not just as patriarchs and families, because they are, there's a generational bias over there. But what I find amazing in talking to people who are younger men, right, is that some of these biases are very inherent even in the 18 to 24-year olds who are in colleges, some of the most prestigious, well known colleges in India that you can think of. So it's not changed. Right. So, let's talk then about your research that's ongoing about men, and how does that reframe the question around women?
I think one huge mistake that's been made in our search for gender equality and women's empowerment is that we've completely left the men out, right? That needs to be corrected, because you can't change the male female dynamic till both wake up to their parts in it, right? And we can't change millions of people unless we do it in a compassionate, non-judgmental way, right? So there are no safe spaces for men to speak. There are more safe spaces now for women to speak. So we need to have the uh, same kind of support for men to be able to talk about their issues and problems and the pressures they are under to be manly men, right? To always know what the answers, to always feel powerful, to assume that they feel powerful, etc. I think the same cultural pressures that create girls create boys. So we've been doing interviews. I've been doing interviews with 7-year-olds to right now 50 and 60-year-olds, but mostly young men, 20 between the ages of, I would say, 16 to 23. And there is a generational shift. There's no denying that. I think all the public conversation on women's empowerment and girls' importance of girls' education has had. I can see a shift even in the 7 years. Yeah, in the 5 years that I was talking to everyone I met about these issues to now when I've restarted earlier this year. And I think it's very much like we see in girls, but probably worse because there's been very little attention given to boys' lives and their insights and how they're thinking and how they are uh, expected to behave in a certain way. So, a very simple example that boys by 7 or by 9 know that they shouldn't be crying, that crying is girly behavior, right? Where's that coming from?
Mhm.
It's coming from अरे लड़के नहीं रोते लड़कियां जैसे नहीं लो लौंडिया नहीं बनो all these don't cry like a girl or don't become a girl. It's all around us. So of course you can have education and all the rest of it, but by the time a kid goes to school, they've already learned, and then there are in schools sites, I think, emerging as sites of greater uh, gender reinforcement rather than opening up the boxes of what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy. And there's tremendous peer pressure on boys to be manly or to behave like boys, to be aggressive, to treat girls in a particular way, or sexual innuendo, all the kinds of things we know about. It's happening on the sides of boys and men too.
A lot of
So I think,
health as
so,
well, right?
sorry?
Mental health issues of boys as well.
There are huge mental health issues because they don't have any place that they can go to therapy is not common in India, and therapy has such a bad label still, bad rap. But forget therapy, they don't have deep friendships with other boys or other men where they feel they can talk about their problems, which makes having a problem is synonymous, is exactly the same as being a weak man. Why would anyone want to be seen as a weak woman or a weak man? Right? So it all goes undercover. And so again, if we can uncover this, that this is happening to everyone and you're not alone, just like I do with Chup, these are issues that every woman faces. It's happening in every household. Can we do that? The same thing for men. And while still remembering and seeing that in the present setup, we assume that men are more powerful, and most times they are. If you consider a man and woman at the same level in the same social class with the same education, our perceptions and how we treat the man is different from how we treat a woman.
Like, it's very critical that both change. Let's pause for a minute on the on the actual book marketing process, right? And it's perhaps evolved significantly from the time your first book came out to now. And today we talk a lot about authors being out there and marketing the book, marketing the message. So what has what is your perception on that? Because Chup obviously has gone from a book to a movement, as I'm seeing, versus what was your process with some of the other books, and how important is it to have that that the book is followed by many other elements that connect it to people.
I think marketing is really important. I think I did it terribly. I was very lucky to have Chiki Sarkar, who published the book, who pitched it to various not publishers, newspapers, etc. And I think because of the content, then
Sure.
it traveled on its own. I think if I was to do it again,
Mhm.
I would do it very differently. I think 95% of success of a book is marketing. And I didn't do that, and I now regret it, because I would love to see this book and shorter versions of this book in every woman's hand and be translated into local languages. So it takes a lot to market a book. I'm not a good marketer, so that's certainly not me. When I worked with the World Bank, there was a whole department that did the marketing, right? So I don't have the experience or the skills in marketing. But for all you budding writers, I would say, don't worry about the marketing when you're writing, but
Mhm.
it's very important thing to do in today's world. I think the other part that I responded to in a better, in more, again, that's who I am, right? Was women, hundreds of women wrote after once the book came out and once they've seen the TED talk or read any articles, written to me and said, okay, what next? How do I change?
Sure.
Because that's really the fundamental issue. And so I've created Chup circles, which are safe places for women to come together and talk, create groups. It's a movement that anyone can start, that can be started in companies, or in neighborhoods, or in schools. The material is very simple. It's based on a participatory process. We have a curriculum organized by the habits. It's very playful, it's fun, and the trick is to create a safe, non-judgmental space and to work through these activities. And that really is powerful and transformative. And then you have a group you can trust with, where you don't have to pretend that you start the change process.
It's really fantastic because you're really doing the paid forward through.
That's the pay forward, but it now needs to be picked up by for systemic change.
Sure.
I can only do so much, right? Then, but it has to be taken up by others and become part of, whether it's CII or Deloitte or Google, or that process of change has to be within organizations. Otherwise, it's one more thing for people to do. So there are groups that have taken this up, but a lot more needs to happen to to continue the movement, deepen the movement.
Deepa, we could have continued for another hour
Ever.
or more. And it's really fascinating, both your journey, what you're writing about, and the way you approach, what you're writing about. And how it needs to translate from the pages of the book to a message to something that impacts lives. So as we wrap up today's really fantastic conversation, thank you so much. But I would love for you to say some closing remarks on the women who might be listening today, both women as women, but and you've talked a lot about it through the conversation, but also as women who might be looking at writing, perhaps balancing career and writing, because that's what you've done a lot in your life. You had a professional career but you've written books. So if you could talk a little bit about that and give your message.
I think I think my basic message to all women is don't underestimate yourself. You're already amazing. You're already wonderful. If you're alive and educated, you're way ahead of the rest of the world. So find your purpose, follow your passion, and then be persistent. Don't give up at the first obstacle that shows up. In terms of writing, if you want to be a writer, start writing. It's very simple. Start writing. It's in the practice. It's really in the practice that you become a writer. And don't make huge promises. One of the things that I used to do is make a huge promise. I'm going to change. I'm going to not do this. And, for 2 hours of exercise or 1 hour of writing, don't make big promises. Make small promises, because small promises you can hold on to and change one thing at a time. So if you want to be a writer and you've never written, write for 5 minutes every day. Whatever your thoughts are in your break, on the bus, in your taxi, in your Uber, whatever it is, start writing. Amish Tripathi wrote his books during his commute, right? So the rest is excuses. So paper and pencil, or if you have a computer, however you want to do, Start writing. I think that's the way to become a writer. And then make a promise to yourself, but make promises that you can keep and don't make them big. So instead of saying for the rest of my life, I'm going to write for 5 minutes every day, that's frightening. Make it small. Say for 1 week, I'm going to write for 5 minutes every day at such and such time.
Sure.
So make it very specific so you can monitor yourself and put it on your calendar. And then after a week, extend it for another week or do it for 40 days. There's a mythology that it takes 40 days to change a habit. So that's a good time framework for you to do it. And then see if it brings you joy or if it's just pain. If it's only pain, you probably want to try something else. But if there's some excitement in that writing process, or when you've seen what you've written, it's great. And the second thing I would say for all writers is don't let your critic go. Put your judge and your critic aside because otherwise you'll never get started. We all have very strong internal critical voices. Just put them to bed or take a break from them and then just write. Just do free writing. If you don't have a thought, it doesn't matter. Just free write. And I think that's the way to become a writer is just by writing. And then take on small challenges, write for your local magazine, write a poem, write for your sisters and brothers. You can do writing in so many ways that there's absolutely no excuse for not writing if you want to be a writer. That's what I would say.
Fantastic. So, with that message, Deepa, thank you so much. It's really been fantastic having you on this segment today. And I
Thank
wish
you.
you all the very best. I hope we talk sometime again about your new book, which will
New
emerge from
book.
your research.
Actually, the new is going to be a podcast. So look out for a podcast first because I want to open the conversation with men. So we've been doing interviews. So we hope it'll come out in sometime late November on
Fantastic.
men,
Thank you so
on
much.
men and masculinity.
Will do. And we will make sure to tag your TED Talk, which is wonderful. And I hope that our listeners
Thank you.
and viewers today go and watch the TED Talk, watch, I think, there's several other interviews of yours which are available online. So we will make sure that we send the links out. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you, Amrita. Bye bye.
Bye.